It all started when my family decided to move. We had been living in the same neighborhood for years, and the house we were in no longer felt like home. My parents, tired of the cramped space and high rent, began looking for a new place. They wanted something bigger, something that would give us more freedom. I remember that morning well. I was scrolling through my phone, bored, sitting in the back seat of the car as we drove through the suburban street. The neighborhood was quiet, and the weather was perfect, with the sun shining down in a gentle, almost comforting way. My mum and dad were discussing the potential houses we could buy. They were excited, but I wasn't. I didn't care much about moving. I was just tired of the whole idea. I had my friends, my routine, and I didn't want anything to change. Then we turned onto Willow Street. It was a narrow road lined with old oak trees whose twisted branches almost seemed to whisper in the wind. We had been looking at houses all morning, and this one was the last. The house stood at the end of the street, a large Victorian-style building that looked like it belonged in a historical novel. It had a kind of grandeur to it, with its faded green paint and intricate woodwork, though it was clear that it hadn't been taken care of in years. The moment we pulled up in front of the house, I got a weird feeling. It wasn't a voice telling me to run or a warning of any kind. It was more of a strange, instinctive chill down my spine. I didn't know why I felt that way. After all, it was just a house. The owner of the house was already there, standing on the porch, waiting for us. He was an older man, probably in his mid-60s, with a cane in one hand and a warm smile. I couldn't help but notice how strange he looked. His clothes were a bit outdated, almost like he'd stepped out of another era, but he seemed friendly and my parents immediately hit it off with him. We walked inside, and the house, it had high ceiling, polished wooden floor, and large windows bar that let in lots of. There was a cozy charm to it that made it homey. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, I didn't know what it, but there was an odd energy. While my parents talked, we stayed in the living room, just observing. As the conversation went on, I noticed something strange. The owner's expression, which had been warm and welcoming, suddenly changed. One minute he was laughing and smiling with and the next, his face hardened into something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. His smile vanished, replaced by an intense, almost sinister. It was brief, but it was enough to make my heart race. I quickly turned my attention away, pretending to look at my phone, though I kept my eyes on it. I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it was nothing. But then, as quickly as the change came, he turned back to my parents and resumed the conversation, his face once again calm. Later that evening, I mentioned it to my mum. She didn't think much of it, brushing it off as him just being socially awkward. Maybe he was just having a moment, he said, not seeming too concerned. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something about that man, about the way his mood changed so abruptly, had unsettled me. Still, we ended up buying the house. It was a great deal, and despite my gut feeling, I thought it would be a fresh start. The house was ours now. We were going to make it our home. The first few days in the house were normal. We unpacked, settled into our rooms, and began to get a feel for the new place. My parents seemed happy with the change. I, on the other hand, was still adjusting. I missed my old friend, my old routine, and the comfort of the familiar. But it wasn't anything I couldn't get used to. One Sunday, a week after we moved in, my parents decided to go to church. They asked if I wanted to come with them, but I wasn't in the mood. I told them I'd stay home, and they didn't mind. I was alone, and I wasn't bothered by it. It was a nice, quiet Sunday morning. The house was still unfamiliar to me, but it felt peaceful. The sun was shining through the window, and the air was cool, almost I went upstairs to my room to relax, thinking I'd use the time to catch up on some sleep, or just read a book. The house was so big, so different from the cramped place we had before. But despite its size, there was something off about it. I tried to ignore that feeling. I knew I was just being paranoid, especially since no one else had seemed to notice anything strange. But something about the house made me maybe it was the sight. The house was so still, as though it had been waiting for someone to break the calm. I was in my room, half-heartedly scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind. It had been a stormy morning, so it wouldn't have been unusual for the wind to make noise around the house. But this was different. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It came from outside, from the side of the house. Loud, sharp bangs, one after the other, It was so loud that it rattled the windows. My heart started racing and my stomach churned. It sounded like someone was banging on the side of the house. Who could it be? There was no one out there, at least not that I could see. I waited for a moment, trying to reason it out. Maybe it was the storm. The wind must have caused something to knock against the wall. I wasn't sure, but I didn't feel like checking it out. After a few minutes, the banging stopped. I sighed with relief, thinking maybe I had been imagining things. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard something else. Footstep, soft, slow footstep, coming from downstairs. I froze again, my blood running cold. My first thought was that it was my parents, that they had come back early. But then I realized they wouldn't have come back without texting me. I hadn't heard the door open, and the footstep, they didn't sound like my parents' footsteps. They were heavier, more deliberate, like someone was walking around the house, checking things out. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. I listened closely, trying to hear what was going on. The footsteps moved around the downstairs, slow and measured. I could hear the creak of the floorboards as they walked across the living room. I heard the sound of chairs being shifted, kitchen cabinets opening, and the fridge door creaking. My heart was racing. I knew something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone in the house. I quickly grabbed my phone and texted my mum, telling her to call me when she had a chance. Then I locked my bedroom door quietly, my hands shaking. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the corner of my room just in case I ever needed it. But right now, I didn't know if it would do me any good. I was just a 17-year-old girl, small and unarmed, hiding in my room while someone was walking around down. My stomach twisted into a knot. I wasn't sure what was worse, the idea of someone being in the house or the idea of me being completely alone with no one to help. I called 911, my voice shaking, as I explained what was happening. I gave them the address, and the operator promised they'd send someone out as soon as possible. But I knew it would take a while. My parents were at least 30 minutes away. I was alone. I could only hope they'd get here before it was too late. As I waited, I heard the footsteps coming closer. They were moving up the stairs now, slowly, as though whoever was downstairs knew exactly where they were going. I could hear the creak of the floorboards with every step. I felt my heart in my throat, and my hands were shaking as I held the bat. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath. The doorknob turned. I could hear it, faint but unmistakable. The person on the other side was trying to open the door. I had locked it, so it didn't budge, but I could feel the weight of their presence on the other side. I could hear their breathing, slow, deep breaths. I was paralyzed, unable to move. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do next. I could hear them walking away, but it wasn't over. I could still feel the tension in the air, like something was wrong. Then I heard the back door creak open, and a few moments later, I heard it slam shut. I didn't move until I heard the sirens in the distance. I was frozen in place, holding my waiting for the sound of the felt like hours before they finally arrived. But when they did, I went downstairs to let them in. They didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing out of the ordinary. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. My mum arrived shortly afterward, and she asked my stepdad if he had changed the lock. He hadn't. But the creepiest part came after they started looking around the house. The hallway outside my room had been vacuumed that morning. The floors were spotless, but now there were shoe prints, large shoe prints. No one in our house had shoes that big, and they stopped right outside my bedroom door. We changed the locks the next day and added extra security, but I never felt safe in that house again. Even now, thinking back on it, I get chilled. Whoever or whatever was in that house with me that too. The sound of the sirens was like a lifeline, a signal that help was finally here. I couldn't tell you how long I had been sitting there, holding my breath and praying that whoever was in the house would leave before the police arrived. Time felt like it was moving in slow motion, each second stretching into eternity. My hands were still trembling, clutching the baseball bat so hard my knuckles turned white. The silence that filled the house after the footsteps stopped was suffocating, like the calm before the storm. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. When I heard the sirens getting closer, I felt a small rush of relief, but it was fleeting. The worst part was that I wasn't sure if the person had really left. The back door slamming shut could have been a ploy to make me think they were gone. For all I knew, they were still here, hiding somewhere and waiting for the right moment to strike. I stayed in my room, barely breathing. As the sound of the sirens grew loud, they were getting closer. I could hear the police car pulling up outside, the crunch of tires on gravel. A moment later, I heard the pounding on the front door. "Police, open up!" a voice called out. I quickly grabbed my phone again, texting my mum one more time. My heart was still racing. I was terrified, but I also knew I couldn't just stay hidden forever. I had to let them in. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down, and opened the door. The two officers who stepped into the house looked calm and collected, though I could see the concern in their eyes. They were scanning the hall, checking every corner, every shadow. They had clearly been trained for situations like, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a tension in the air that didn't belong. "Are you all right?" one of the officers asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Can you tell us what happened?" I nodded, trying to steady my shaking. I was alone. I heard noises downstairs, footsteps, like someone was walking around the house. I locked myself in my room and called 911. The officer nodded and gestured for his partner to check the rest of the house. "We'll take a look around. You did the right thing by locking yourself in here." I watched as the officers moved through the house, their footsteps heavy on the floor. They checked every room, every closet, and every corner. They even checked the back door, which was still slightly ajar. But when they returned to me, their faces were confused. "There's no sign of forced entry," one of the officers said. "Nothing disturbed. No one here but you." I stared at him, feeling the weight of the words settle in my chest. "But I heard someone. I'm sure of it. They were here." The officer frowned, clearly trying to make sense of it. "I understand, but there's nothing here to indicate someone was inside. Are you sure you didn't just imagine it?" I shook my head, my eyes wide. "No, I know what I heard. It wasn't my imagination." They seemed to be weighing my words carefully, and I could see the skepticism on their face. I couldn't blame them. If I were in their shoes, I'd probably be questioning everything too. But I knew what I had experienced. I knew I wasn't imagining the footsteps, the sounds of things moving around. I wasn't crazy. As the officers continued to search the house, I felt a growing sense of unease. They hadn't found anything, and that only made things worse. The fact that no one had broken in, that nothing had been disturbed, left me feeling even more vulnerable. Where had that person gone? Why did they leave so suddenly? And then, something caught my eye. As I looked around the room, I noticed the hallway. My mum had vacuumed the floors earlier that day, so the hallway had been spotted. But now, there were shoe prints. Big, heavy shoe prints that weren't there before. My heart skipped a beat. I took a few steps toward the hallway, my eyes fixed on the prints. They were unmistakable. They weren't from anyone in there. The prints were too large, too heavy to be from any of us, and they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stared at the officers hadn't gone upstairs, so these prints couldn't have been theirs. And the fact that they stopped right outside my door, it made my stomach turn. I quickly told the officers about the prints, and they went to check the hallway. The man who had been standing by the door asked if I had changed the locks, but I hadn't. My parents hadn't even considered it. The thought of changing the locks hadn't crossed my mind. But after everything that had happened, I knew we had to. I stood in the living room, trying to make sense of it. The officers didn't find anything, no sign of a break-in or anyone else being in the house. It was as if the person had just vanished. But I knew I knew that someone had been there. When my mum finally came home, she took one look at the prints in the hallway and turned to my stepdad. "Did you change the locks?" she asked. He looked confused, and he shook his head. "No, I didn't. Why?" "Because," she said, her voice quiet but filled with something darker, "we need to. We changed the locks the next day. We added extra security. But even with all the precautions, I never felt safe in that house. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my sight, never went away. And every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The next few days felt strange. It was like the house was haunted by the memory of my parents, though they seemed to have put the whole thing behind them, started doing little things to make the house feel safer. They changed the lock, installed extra security and made sure all the windows were locked at night. But for me, none of it helped. No matter how many times I checked the doors, no matter how many locks I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the house. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself that I was being paranoid, that the banging sound, the footsteps, the strange feeling I had been experiencing, it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But every time I walked through the house, every time I was alone, I couldn't escape the sense that something wasn't right. The feeling was worse at night. At night, the house seemed to come alive. The creaks in the floorboards were louder, the wind outside rattled the window, and the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I hated being alone after dark, but I tried to pretend it was just my imagination, that nothing was wrong. One evening, a few days after the police had, I was in my room, getting ready for. I had the lights on, but there was something about the way the shadows moved across the walls that made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even though I knew no one was there, I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up over my head as if that would protect me. The house was silent, and for a moment I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe it was just a strange series of events that had gotten to me. But then, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible noise. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but then it came again, a faint scratching sound, like something was dragging across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled the covers tighter around me, my breath quickening. The noise grew louder. It was coming from the hallway. I could hear it clearly now, a dragging sound, as though something was being pulled across the floorboard. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that it was nothing, but then the sound stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something, a soft, slow, creaking noise, like someone was walking down the hallway. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table, my hands shaking as I unlocked it and called my mum. The phone rang, and I pressed it to my ear, praying she'd answer. But the sound of the phone ringing seemed to echo through the quiet house, making everything feel more real, more sinister. She didn't pick up. I sent her a text, begging her to come home, to call me, to let me know she was safe. But still, there was no answer. The footsteps grew closer, closer to my room. I could hear them slow and heavy. They stopped just outside my door. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The door was locked. But what if it wasn't enough? What if someone was going to break in? The handle jiggled slightly, and for a moment I thought someone was trying to get in. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, listening, waiting for any sign that the danger had. But the silence that followed was unbearable. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I finally gathered the courage to get up. I grabbed the baseball bat once again, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind, should I call the police again? Should I check the house? I decided to check the house, though I knew it was probably a terrible idea. I quietly opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hall, my eyes scanning the dark. The house felt cold, almost unnaturally, as though the air itself was heavier in the dark. I walked slowly down the hall, trying to make as little noise as possible. I reached the staircase and hesitated, looking down into the darkness below. It felt like someone was waiting for me, hiding in the shadow, watching me. I stepped carefully down the stairs, every creak of the wood sending a chill down my spine. The living room was quiet. The front door was still locked. I moved cautiously through the house, checking every room, every closet, every corner. But there was no sign of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that someone was still watching. I didn't know if it was the same person who had been here before, or if it was someone new, but I was sure I wasn't alone. I checked every window, double-checked every lock. I made sure the doors were all secured. Then, I went back upstairs, back to my room. I locked the door and sat by the window, watching for any sign of movement. My phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a message from my mum asking how I was doing. "I'm fine," I texted back quickly, even though I wasn't sure if I was. "Just a little freaked out," she replied almost immediately. "We'll be home soon. I love you." I stayed in my room that night, too scared to leave, too scared to sleep. The house felt like it was holding its breath, like it was waiting for something to happen. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was okay, but the feeling, the sense of being watched, didn't go away. The days after that night felt like a blur. The unsettling feeling in the house refused to go away. No matter how many times I checked the locks, closed the blind, or made sure every corner was, it was like I could feel the presence of something or someone still lurking, hidden somewhere in the shadow. I tried to go on with my daily life, going to school, hanging out with friends, doing normal things. But every time I walked through I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was around 2 weeks after the first incident, when things started to escalate. I had stayed home alone that Friday afternoon. Just like the last, my parents had gone out for a while, and I didn't feel like going with them. It was a rainy day, the kind where everything outside is grey and wet, and the sound of the rain tapping against the windows seemed to drown out everything else. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the anxiety that had been creeping up on me for days. But then, I heard it again, a soft creak coming from downstairs. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the rain, but then a second creak, and then a third. It was the unmistakable sound of someone walking around the house, moving through the kitchen, and then down the hall toward the stairs. I froze. My heart started racing, and for a second I considered running out of the house. But then I realized I was alone. My parents weren't coming back for another hour, and I would never make it in time. I had no choice but to stay hidden. Just like last time, I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I quickly dialed 911. The operator answered almost immediately, asking if I was in danger. My voice barely came out as I whispered, "I think someone's in the house. I'm alone, please." The operator told me to stay on the line and assured me that help was on the way. I didn't hang up. I couldn't. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, closer to the stairs. The creaks grew louder, like the person was coming up to my floor, taking each step slowly, deliberately. I had never been so scared in my life. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. My breath hitched in my throat. I heard the door handle jiggle, like someone was trying to open it, but the door was locked. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I was sure the person outside could hear. And then, just as quickly as it started, the noise, the footstep, the jiggling of the handle, everything went silent. My head was spinning. What was happening? Who was out there? Why had they stopped? I waited. I waited so long that I thought I might faint from the tension. But after what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered the courage to move. I slowly pulled myself out of my bed, my hands gripping the baseball bat, my eyes darting around the room. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the dark hallway. Nothing. I stepped out, heart hammering in my chest, and crept toward the stairs. The house was eerily quiet. The only sound was the rain hitting the windows and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. My breath came in shallow gasps as I made my way down the hall, my eyes fixed on the staircase ahead of me. I reached the stairs and hesitated. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I slowly began to descend, each step echoing through the silence. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The front door was wide open. It had been locked when I last checked. There was no way anyone could have opened it without me here, especially with how careful. The door was wide open, and there was no sign of anyone. The rain was coming down in soaking the pool, but there was no sign of movement. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stepped, closing the door with trembling. My mind raced. Was this a sign that whoever had been in the house before had left? Or had they gone out the back door? I couldn't be sure. But one thing was for certain, I didn't feel safe anymore. The silence in the house felt oppressive, suffocating. It was like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even though there was no one there. It was the same feeling I had gotten before, the same dread that clung to me like a shadow. I checked all the windows, double-checking the lock. I moved quickly through the house, but no matter how many times I checked, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was still here. I knew I couldn't stay here alone for much longer. By the time my parents got home, I was a wreck. I could barely look them in the eye as I tried to explain what had. They listened, but I could see the doubt in their face. They wanted to believe me, but I could tell they thought I was just overreacting. It wasn't the first time I'd been scared alone at night, but I knew someone was, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever it wasn't gone. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the soft creak of the floorboard, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hall. And once again, They stopped right outside my door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. I heard the handle jiggle, just like before. And then, the silence. I lay there, frozen in terror, waiting for something to happen. But the footsteps never came again. The door never opened. The house was silent once more. But I couldn't sleep. The feeling was still there, lingering in the dark corners of my room. I knew something was wrong. Something was in this house, and I had no idea how to get rid of it. The night after I heard those footsteps outside my door felt like an eternity. I could hardly sleep, tossing and turning in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The silence was suffocating, but every sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified in the darkness. My mind raced with thoughts of what had happened before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I was awake when my parents returned late that evening, both of them arguing lightly about something that didn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. They were just trying to live a normal life, to carry on as if nothing strange had happened. But for me, every little noise seemed like a warning. I couldn't get the image of the door handle jiggling outside my room out. I kept thinking about the fact that whoever or whatever had been in the house before could come back at any moment. The next few days felt like a strange dream. Things were quieter, but my paranoia was growing. My parents seemed to have forgotten all about the weirdness that had taken place. They were going about their routines, and I tried to do the same, even though it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the feeling of being watched. I didn't want to bring it up again with them. They hadn't believed me the first time, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be seen as paranoid or overreacting, but it was like the house itself was pressing in on me, forcing me to remember what happened. On the fourth night, after the last incident, things got worse, much worse. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the thoughts that wouldn't leave my mind. The wind howled outside, the rain still pouring down in torrents. It was a typical stormy night, the kind where everything felt damp and cold, even inside the house. And then, I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but then the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't a knock, more like a gentle tap, rhythmic in nature, almost like someone was tapping their fingers against the wall or maybe against the floor. It was coming from the living room, directly below my room. I lay still, straining my ear. My heart pounded in my chest. Was someone in the house again? I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I sent a quick message to my mum, asking if she and my dad were home yet. I didn't get an immediate. The tapping continued. It was unnerving, slow at first, then gradually getting faster, like whoever was doing it was getting closer to the stairs. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it felt like it was circling around the house, moving in and out of the room. The silence that followed the tapping was even worse. I could feel the tension building, every second stretching longer than the last. The air in my room felt thicker, colder, like something was watching me from the shadows. I waited, and then I heard something else. A low, guttural voice, almost a whisper, came from the bottom of the stairs. It was too faint to make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, almost desperate. The kind of bunk voice that made your skin crawl like something was trying to speak to you, but in a language you didn't understand. My stomach twisted in knots, and a wave of dread washed over me. I knew I wasn't imagining. There was something in the house. I reached for the baseball bat beside my bed, gripping it tight. My hands were sweating, my heart thundering. I had to check. I couldn't just stay in my room while something was happening downstairs. I had to know what it was. I opened the door, barely making a sound. The hallway was dark, and I couldn't see anything clearly, but the sounds coming from below were unmistakable. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around, making sure I could hear them. I crept down the stairs as quietly as I could, each step feeling like a small explosion in the silence. The living room was dark, shadows pooling in the corners of the room, and the flickering light from the storm outside cast strange shapes across the floor. The room was empty. There was no one. I checked every corner, even opening the door to the closet, but nothing. The tapping had stopped, and the voice had faded away. It was as if everything had been a figment of my imagination, but I knew it was. I could still feel it, presence of something that didn't belong. I decided to check the back door, just to be sure. Maybe it had been left open again. or maybe someone had snuck in through the yard. I went to the kitchen and pushed open the door that led outside. It was locked, but as I turned the handle, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud just outside the door. They were big, almost too big to belong to anyone in the house, and they led right up to the door, stopping at the threshold. I felt my blood run cold. Someone had been here. Someone had come inside again, and I had no idea who or what they were. I quickly locked the door again and rushed back upstairs, locking myself in my room. I sent another message to my mum, telling her to come home as soon as possible. But when I checked my phone, I saw the last message she had sent me just an hour ago. We're on our way back. Everything okay, son? It didn't feel okay. None of it felt okay. I stayed in my room shaking, trying to convince myself it was all a mistake, that the footprints weren't real. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen them, and I knew they weren't mine. The house felt alive again, like it was watching, waiting. The shadows in the corners seemed darkened, and the silence was suffocating. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. And the worst part, it felt like whoever or whatever had been haunting me closer. And this time, I wasn't sure I could escape. The next morning, I woke up feeling completely drained. I hadn't slept all night. The events from the previous evening haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering. The footprints outside the back door, the whispering voice, the rhythmic tap. All of it felt so real, but somehow no one seemed to believe me. I'd sent my parents multiple texts, but they didn't seem to understand the urgency of the situation. They thought I was just scared, maybe overthinking things because of how quiet and isolated we had become living in that old house. They didn't get it. That day, they left again. It was one of those rare moments where I was alone in the house during the day, and despite my fears, I tried to act normal. I had to. I needed to keep my mind occupied, to prove to myself that everything would be fine. But as the hours passed, I felt more and more uneasy. It was late afternoon when the real terror returned. I was sitting in the kitchen, sipping some water, trying to force myself to eat something. The storm from the previous night had finally passed, and the sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. Everything seemed quiet, almost peaceful. But then I heard it. It started as a faint scratching sound. It was so soft at first that I thought I might have imagined, but then it came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from the attic. I froze. The attic was directly above the kitchen, and the sound was unmistakable. It was something or someone moving around up there. I could hear what sounded like furniture being knocked over, followed by dragging noises, like someone was shifting something heavy. It was the last thing I wanted to deal with, but I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly climbed the stairs to the attic. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. It had always been that way, never fully closed, but I had never given it much. I had assumed it was just the house settling, that the old door didn't close properly. As I pushed the door open, the air felt colder, almost free. The space was dim, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally in the dim light of my flat. I could see old furniture, boxes, and various forgotten things that had been left behind by the previous owners. And that's when I saw it. Something was moving in the far corner of the attic, near the window. It was a dark figure, but it was hard to make out exactly what it was. I blinked, trying to focus, but the figure didn't move, at least not in the way that a person would. It almost looked like it was shifting, like it was struggling to form into a more solid shape. I felt my blood run cold. My legs went numb, and I could barely hold the flashlight as my hands started to shake. The figure moved again, this time closer to me, but not in any way that made sense. It was like it was floating, gliding through silently and unnaturally. And then I heard the whisper again. It was the same low, guttural voice I had heard before, but this time it was clear. It was right behind me, so close that I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing, just the empty space of the attic, the shadows playing tricks on my... I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room, desperate to find anything that would make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. I couldn't explain it. Suddenly, the figure moved again, more rapidly this time, coming straight toward me. I could see its outline now, tall, dark, and featureless. It was almost like a silhouette, but with edges that were too sharp, too defined to be a normal person. I screamed and ran. I didn't even look back. I bolted down the stairs, my breath ragged and uneven, my feet stumbling as I tried to get away. I slammed the door to the attic shut behind me, my mind racing, my body shaking. I didn't stop running until I reached my room, where I locked the door behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, unable to process what had just happened. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling, and sent another frantic message to my pet. This time, I didn't care if they thought I was overreacting. I had to make them understand. I told them everything about the figure in the attic, about the whispering voice, and how it felt like something was trying to drag me into that room. I didn't get an immediate reply, and for a moment, I feared they wouldn't take me seriously. But then, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my door. I stood frozen, waiting, listening to the unmistakable sound of someone walking around the house. It was happening again. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was out there to get closer. I knew I needed to do something, anything. I slowly opened my door, trying not to make a sound, and peeked out into the hallway. I could see the shadow of someone standing at the end of the hall, just barely visible in the dim light from the window. I didn't wait for them to get any closer. I slammed the door shut again, locked it, and ran to my window. I had to get out of there. I climbed out onto the roof, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care how dangerous. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. I jumped down into the yard and ran to the front of the house, my mind racing. I had to get to safety, to get away from whatever was inside. When I reached the front door, something wasn't right. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. A feeling of dread washed over me as I stepped forward. I wasn't alone anymore, and whatever was in the house with me had followed me outside. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Every part of me knew that I had to leave. I could feel the suffocating weight of the house pressing down on me. The silence was unbearable, and the shadows that clung to the wall seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. I had to escape. It didn't matter what it took. I needed to get out, to find some sort of relief from the constant fear that gnawed at my mind. I didn't wait for my parents to come home. I couldn't. I wasn't sure if they would even believe me. I didn't know if anyone would. It didn't matter at that point. I was done trying to convince them. I grabbed a bag and threw in what I could. My phone, a few clothes, my wallet, and that was it. I didn't even bother to think clearly. The only thing I could focus on was getting out of that house. I quietly crept down the stairs, my heart racing in my chest, hoping the figure from the attic wouldn't return. I was afraid to even breathe too loudly. The house was so still, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. As I reached the front door, I hesitated for a moment. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. It was like there was something watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I slowly turned the doorknob, and the door opened with a soft creak. The moment I stepped out, I could hear the sound of the wind outside, the leaves rustling against the ground. It felt like freedom, but I also felt like I was running away from something that would never truly leave me. I walked quickly to my car, trying to ignore the feeling that something was following me. But when I got to the driveway, I stopped. I didn't want to look back, but I did. From the window above, I saw the figure again. It wasn't in the attic anymore. It was standing in the window of my bedroom, just watching me. I could see the outline of its shape, tall and shadowy, but it wasn't moving. It just stood there, as if it was waiting for me to turn around. I couldn't stand to look at it for another second. I slammed my car door shut and started the engine. I backed out of the driveway quickly, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. As I drove away, I could still feel the weight of the house, even though I was no longer there. The road stretched on, but it felt like I was still trapped in the same nightmare. I could still see the figure in my mind, still hear its whispers in the back of my head. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know where I could be safe anymore. The feeling of being watched never left. The house, that figure, the whisper, they would always be a part of me now. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked down at it, expecting it to be a message from my pets asking where I was. But it wasn't them. It was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "You can't escape." I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The text was followed by another, "You belong to it now." I couldn't breathe. I pulled over to the side of the road, panic taking over my body. The message made my skin crawl, my heart beating so fast I thought it would burst out of my chest. I turned the phone off, hoping to block out the nightmare that had followed me. But even with it off, I still felt the same chill, the same presence. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was I running from something, or was I running toward? I couldn't sleep. That night, after everything that had happened, I couldn't even close my eyes for more than a few. Every time I drifted off, I'd feel a jolt wake me up, my heart racing, sweat covering my skin. The fear was gnawing at me, sinking into my bones. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it felt like something was waiting for me. I kept checking my phone every few minutes, afraid of receiving another text, another cryptic message, but the phone remained silent. I tried to focus on the road, on getting away, but it was useless. Every noise, every flicker of light in the dark made me jump. Finally, I reached a small town several hours away from the house, somewhere I'd never been before. I found a cheap motel and rented a room. It was a rundown place, the kind of place people stay when they have nowhere else to go. The flickering neon sign outside didn't help, but at least it felt like a temporary refuge. I threw my bag on the bed, locked the door behind me, and immediately pulled the curtains shut. It felt wrong, but I couldn't risk having anything outside peering in, especially with how sensitive I'd become to every little thing. The room was too quiet, but as I sat on the bed, a strange thought crossed my mind. I had to do something. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't run forever. I needed to face it. I didn't know how. I didn't know where to start. But something told me that the figure, the thing that had haunted me, wasn't just in. It wasn't something I could escape from by leaving. The house wasn't just a place. It was a part of something. I was a part of something. The thought terrified, but I had to figure out what it was. I needed answers. I decided to look up the house. I couldn't believe I hadn't done it sooner. I had to know who had lived there before, what had happened there, anything that might give me a clue as to why it was so wrong. I opened my laptop, but as I did, the chill ran down my spine. The air in the room had suddenly dropped several degrees. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just a draft from the old window, but deep down, I knew it was something else. I searched for the house's address, hoping to find something, anything. The first few results were just realistic, but then I found something more disturbing. A local news article from years ago. The headline read, "Family disappears without a trace. Authorities stumped." The article described a family that had lived in the very house I had bought. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind all their belongings. The authorities had searched the house, interviewed neighbors, but there was no sign of foul play, no sign of anything. They just disappeared. I felt my stomach drop. I clicked the link and read more. The family had moved in just a few years before I did. Their door done, and there was nothing particularly special about them. They were a quiet couple with 2 kids, and by all accounts, they kept to themselves. But then, one night, they were gone. The police never figured out what happened. Some people said they'd left town. Others said the house was cursed. It seemed like no one really knew, but that's not what caught my eye. It was the last line of a neighbor reported strange noises coming from the night. They described sounds like scraping and banging, along with a low, unintelligible voice that seemed to come from inside the walls. That was it. That was the same sound the banging, the whispering. It wasn't just me. It had happened before. I tried to steady my breathing, but it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't escape this. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave, to run far away. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no choice. The house wasn't going to let me go. The thing in the house, whatever it wasn't just following me, it was pulling me in. I slammed the laptop shut and stood up. The room felt colder, and the darkness outside seemed to stretch longer, deeper. And then I heard it, a tapping sound, soft, but growing louder, closer. It started at the window like someone tapping on the glass. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing outside. Just the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. But then, the tapping moved, came from the door. I stood frozen, heart racing, knowing that whatever was out there was not here. It was something far worse. The door rattled, then suddenly jerked open, revealing nothing but the empty hallway beyond. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure. It was exactly the same as before, tall, shadowy, featureless. But now I could see something else in the darkness, something worse than anything I had seen before. Its hand. It had hands, long and skeletal, reaching out toward me, and its face. Its face was nothing but a black, a hole where the eyes should have, a face that seemed to absorb the light, pulling everything into it. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed. The thing took a step forward, and as it did, I could hear its whispering again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the thing itself. It was coming from the walls, from the corners of the room. You can't escape. You belong to it now. Couldn't breathe. The figure stood there, its long skeletal hands reaching toward me, the black void where its face should have been staring into my soul. The room was suffocating, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the figure. Every instinct told me to run, to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed by the horror that stood in front of it. It didn't move at first. It just stood there in the doorway, as if it was waiting for me to make a move. I could feel its presence, not just in the room, but in my mind, wrapping around pulling at the edges of my sanity. The air grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the light in the... I could feel the darkness closing in on me, and it felt like I was being suffocated by the weight of whatever was in that doorway. Couldn't let it take. I knew that if I didn't do something now, it would be over. With all the strength I could muster, I took a step back and grabbed the chair by the window. It was a flimsy thing, but it was something. I hurled it at the figure with everything I had, hoping to knock it away, hoping to disrupt whatever force held it in place. The chair passed straight through it, shattering against the wall behind. There was no impact, no resistance. It was like the figure wasn't even real, like it existed in some other realm, some space between worlds that I couldn't touch. It didn't even flinch. I gasped, my hands shook, the terror creeping up my... The figure's hands twitched, its fingers curling slightly, like it was about to reach out and grab me. The sound of its movement was chilling, like dry leaves scraping against each other, a low, rasping sound that made my skin crawl. I couldn't let it get any closer. With no other choice, I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew that I couldn't stay there anymore. My feet hit the floor hard as I sprinted out the door. But I didn't stop to look behind me. I could hear its footsteps now, echoing through the hallway, and every step it took felt like it was closing in on me. I rushed down the stairs, barely registering the sounds around me. The house seemed to stretch, the walls and floors warping, as if it was trying to trap me. I reached the front door and threw it open, the cold night air rushing in. But just as I was about to step outside, the door slammed shut on its own. I screamed in frustration, my panic rising to a fever pitch. I ran to the back door, desperate to get out, but it was locked. I fumbled with the handle, my hands slipping from the sweat, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it, the whisper. It started softly at first, like a distant murmur, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from behind me, from the very walls of the house. The voice was low, unintelligible, but it sent chills down my spine. It sounded like it was speaking directly to me, like it was trying to tell me something. I turned around, my breath hitching in my throat, and that's when I saw the figure. It wasn't just standing in the hallway, and it was right in front of me, just a few feet away, its hands reaching toward me with unnerving slowness, its void of a face tilted, as if studying me, waiting for something. I couldn't take it. I couldn't handle it any longer. In a moment of pure instinct, I pushed against the door, slamming my shoulder into it. There was a cracking sound, and the door swung open just enough for me to slip through. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran into the night, the cold air biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. The figure, that thing, couldn't follow me if I left that. I had to be free. But as I ran, something pulled, something deep inside. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore, even though I was outside. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches swaying like they were reaching out to grab me. The shadows in the yard stretched unnaturally, twisting as if alive, and the wind carrying with it a low, almost mournful. I stumbled, my legs giving way beneath me, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself to my feet and kept running, the terror in my chest only growing as I looked around. It was like the world had changed, like I had left the house, but the house hadn't left me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The figure was gone. The house was quiet, just as it had always been. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The house wasn't just a house, it was a curse, and I was trapped in its grip. The farther I ran, the more I realized that no matter where I went, no matter how far I went, I would never be free. The house, that figure, the whisper, they would always be a part of me. And as I ran into the night, I heard it again. The voice, the whispering, calling my name, and I knew it was the beginning.